Welcome back, Dead Elephant.
Oh my goodness.
That's the second time now. In a
Fool me
row.
once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
Welcome back to the Dead Elephants podcast,
Effluence.
part 3 with Cara. This one actually, Cara, is going to be, it's a listener request. So we had a question last season from Rachel,
Yes. Shout out to Rachel. You know who you are.
right? Yep. Talking about burnout. Can you handle some burnout questions? I think it actually dovetails well off the back of what you were talking about last week. We find ourselves in a job that we don't necessarily like. That job, we're now in it for a couple of years. It started to weigh on us. Maybe it started to take some liberties and bleed into a whole bunch of different areas. We start to feel scattered, exhausted, burned out, and that affects a whole bunch of different things. Are you good tackling a little bit of that?
I think so.
Okay. Because I think it's important probably, in all of this, you're trying to tee up the best possible scenario. But we probably have people who are living right now some of the worst possible scenarios. And it's just getting worse and worse and worse. And how do we manage all of that? So let's start with I don't even know if it's a simple question.
No.
What's burnout?
I think it's a hard question because it may be experienced by people in different ways, but I think it's different. Well, let me give you an example. My friend Stephen told me about a time he was planning a church. So he was doing something he loved and he was just getting ready to preach on a Sunday. He was down in the front pew or the front seat ready to get up and preach. And the person at the front sort of did the invitation and he couldn't move.
Wow. Yeah.
He just sat there. He couldn't move. And the guy at the front sort of was a little bit confused, but did the intro again coming up and Stephen still couldn't move. And his wife sort of came from stage left and came over and said, "Are you okay?" And he went, "No, I'm not okay." And those were basically the last words he remembers for a period of time.
Wow.
Like he actually completely blacked out. And he ended up going through a period of months of recovery. And for him, it was something that happened just like that. He was loving his work and everything, and then suddenly he wasn't. But as he deconstructed it, he realized that there was actually a whole load of red flags way before that he should have recognized, that he couldn't see in himself. But I think the difference with some other things that we might talk about is that burnout tends to impact every part of you, who you are. So it impacts you physically, it impacts you emotionally, it impacts you spiritually, it impacts you mentally, impacts your relationships. It impacts all those different areas in a way that perhaps other things do. And it's related in some way to your work. It may be your paid work, it may be other aspects of work that you do, unpaid work, but it's related to that in some way.
So burnout is only applicable, if I can put it that way as a term, if what you're doing for work is the primary source of that end result that Stephen experienced.
Yeah, I think that's probably generally what we would say.
You can't be burnt out from a relationship with your parents. That's just annoying.
That's everyone everywhere.
Demoralizing. That's not the domain of burnout.
They're
Some
exasperating.
people love their parents.
I've read about them in
I
books.
love my parents, and they're
Hey, Mum and Dad.
exasperating. I mean, one of them's with Jesus now, so he's living his best life. He doesn't care.
Yo.
But yes, burnout has to inherently, as a concept as we know it, relate to work.
Yeah. And it's something that you're working at. So if we think of that intent of purpose. So some people may burn out when they're like training for something,
Sure.
for example, but they're actually tackling that activity as work that they're doing for an end goal. So that's the area.
It's not necessarily a monetary thing.
No,
For
no.
example, parenting is a classic example. You may not be getting money from that, but it is your primary work and you can still be burnt out from that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've shared in the last couple of episodes about my journey with depression. I've wondered myself as a punter, what you mentioned, Stephen had red flags ahead of time. What is the difference between when you know it's burnout and it's a a breakdown, or are they so interwoven that it's an unhelpful distinction to make?
I think it's hard, but I think part of what he realised was that his work had become all consuming for him. So whatever the thing is that is your work, has that become completely consuming of you? He realised that it was his identity.
Yeah.
His identity was wrapped up in it, in the sense that he liked to be known as the church plant pastor. He realised that his esteem was wrapped up into it. So he felt good when people were saying, oh, that was fantastic.
Yep.
And he felt bad when people were criticising the church or the work that he was doing. So when your esteem is linked to the work that you're doing, like when you glow, when people praise your kids, and then when they muck up and people make comments about that, and then you just feel your heart crushed in you, then that's probably a sign that your esteem is being linked up to your work in that aspect as well.
What's interesting is, and I'm sure it does come to it at some point, but at no point did you mention the amount of hours you're actually doing. What you just described is an internal relationship that you have with work, not necessarily 80, 90, 100 hours, which brings in faith so clearly, because what you've just described is not workload, it's actually identification.
Yes. And that's the thing, that burnout isn't just about workload. That's what a lot of people think it is. But you can actually get burnt out whether you're spending 100 hours on doing that thing or 20 hours on doing that thing, but it's because your whole self has become consumed by the thing that you're doing.
Fascinating.
I don't know where to go with this, honestly. I read a book by Wayne Cordeiro ages ago, and I feel like a lot of this has to do with sustainability and boundaries. Is that, for me personally, even coming back into ministry, there was things that I wouldn't do. Like, I don't want to be a 5-day-a-week pastor. I think it's healthy for me to have my toe in a workforce, working a different job, being out of that headspace. I'm not available 24/7. I'm totally okay with that. And I think a lot of those things were healthy practices that came in afterwards, because I was going, some of this ministry stuff is super unsustainable.
Yep.
And the other thing is that I think that there's everyone's motor runs at a different velocity. Like some people are Ferraris, but they're Ferraris that only go out on a weekend. And so it's just not a sustainable velocity. And some other people are just Corollas. You rack up 300,000 kilometers and they'll drive all day long, 6 hours a day, every single day without fail. And just having an appreciation that your velocity at which you can work and which you can be present, there is a sustainability level for that. And it may be different to someone else.
Yep.
And, certainly when I was working for a Big Five, it was just really clear that I couldn't keep up with some of the guys. And I felt like there was something wrong with me. And it's like, man, maybe God's created me that way, to be like that. And then there's other places where, I could talk all day, and other people are completely exhausted by that. And so that's a gifting thing, but also having an awareness that even though I could talk all day, should I talk all day?
No.
And
Yes.
It's not beneficial.
Sorry.
All right, I'm done with this
Sorry,
episode.
Duncan.
All right.
I think there's a couple of helpful things that you've said there. One is that you talked about being co-vocational, I would call it, like having different sort of things that you do. And I think that's really important and something.
It's ADHD, but yes.
There's
No,
that
it's
too.
called multi-potentialite. I watched a TED Talk,
Nice. That's
multi-potentialite.
beautiful. It is
Yeah.
called
All right,
that.
okay.
I think it's really critical that we do that, and that helps actually to avoid burnout. So we're not making the one thing the ultimate thing. We're actually sort of spreading the load. So, most of us have multiple roles in society. We're a son, we're a daughter, we're a brother, a sister, we're a parent. We have various work that we do, jobs that we do. We have volunteer stuff we do. Actually making sure that we don't neglect any of those roles. There'll be seasons where one role has to have primacy, but making sure that we are valuing all those roles is really important, and seeing them as all callings from God, I think, is really helpful. Another thing that you talked about there is, capacity, that different people have capacity. So sometimes burnout can happen because we're comparing ourselves to others and trying to keep up with others, or others are are putting certain expectations on us that we just cannot meet. So being aware of your capacity and putting good boundaries in, really, really important. Sometimes the drive comes internally as well. Sometimes we have our own drive about our own expectation and what we want to achieve. And sometimes our own internal motivation may not be helpful, may not be healthy. And we need to be able to be transparent with a couple of people at least so that they can actually hold us accountable for that. So burnout can come from a lot of different places, but being aware of some of the signs, and some of the signs are things where you are lacking good boundaries, where you find it really hard to say no. It's a really classic one.
Which is interesting because Rachel, our listener, framed it, the link between burnout and not being able to say no. So that's really interesting. And
one of the important things in learning how to say no is that if I can say no to this, it means I can say a wholehearted yes to something else. But whereas if I'm really struggling with saying no, I end up getting spread so thin that I'm actually not doing anything very well at all.
Yeah.
So, I think saying no is a really critical one. Other boundaries may be just giving other people the options about what you can and cannot do. So this is a funny story. There's a book called Boundaries, which is written by two guys. And they admitted to an area where they had boundaries played against them, where they had to say, well played you. So their whole ministry, their work was taking off. Fantastic, wonderful. So they needed someone in the office to help them. And so they wrote up a job description. They were interviewing this person, and this person started, and she was going really well. And then one day she said she wanted to have a meeting with both the guys. And so they said, okay. And she called them in. She said, right. She said, here is a list of the things that you want me to do. You've told me that you want me to work this many hours. In this many hours, I can do 10 things off this list. So you choose the 10 things that you want me to do. And they said that was actually really helpful. So she knew she was heading towards burnout if she continued to try and meet their unreasonable expectations. So she actually set the boundaries, but gave them the choice about what they wanted done. So setting boundaries like that, I think, is so healthy and so helpful. I think the other thing that we have from a Christian point of view, we have this beautiful concept of rest, work, rhythm, just recognizing that we have rhythms. I remember sometimes people sort of apply the Sabbath and say, oh no, it's got to be 1 day in 7 and it's got to be that and it's got to happen like this. One time I had this woman come up to me. She worked in a business, in the business area of a business, and she said, look, at month end and at year end, it's just full on. The team are just full on. She said, if I say I need a Sabbath then, she said, I'm actually leaving my team and putting more pressure on them. And I don't think that actually shows them much good about Jesus. And I said, well, think of it as a rhythm. And how much healthier would it be to say, hey, team, we've worked really hard up to this point. Let's plan for breaks after this so that we can rest and recover, so that we can work from rest rather than just be exhausted. And modeling that is actually a really healthy thing. Thinking about rest, work with the rhythms and how you can actually build that in. I think this is the way we're supposed to see work. This is the way we're supposed to see how it relates to the rest of life. And having a rest, work rhythm, I think, helps to break that fear of burnout. And just abiding gives us an opportunity to abide in God, take our strength from God.
Can you unpack a little bit about abiding?
Yeah.
Popular term.
Oh, yeah.
I listen to Abide before bed every night. It's an app. We are not sponsored by them, but I must say their sleep stories are outstanding. If you don't know about the Abide sleep stories, great way to end the day as a Christian.
Are you getting kickbacks on them?
Yeah.
I know.
10%, baby.
All right.
So John 15, it talks about abiding in the vine if you want to flourish. And I think it's really true. It's about sort of really leaning into our relationship with God and working from His strength. And I don't think we do that enough. We all want to be self-made men and women. We all want to charge out ahead. Thanks God, I've got it. I've got this. Off I go. But actually remembering that we are dependent on God, is really critical, and that we can actually draw on His strength. I think that's really, really important, and that's something that Christians have. that should make us amazing in the workplace, except if we separate out work and faith, we never lean into that. But to imagine that we can just abide in Christ in those difficult times when we're struggling or when things are going well, just lean into that relationship with Christ as the thing that is feeding you and strengthening you and is the real source of your meaning and purpose and identity. That's amazing.
I think
you go.
I think abiding also is a velocity thing. So abiding is a slow work, and there needs to be an appreciation that abiding sits counterintuitively to the nature of productivity, because God is calling you to be fruitful. So fruitful people are productive, but it is possible for you being productive, completely unsustainable, and not being fruitful. And the nature of abiding, to your point, is counterintuitive. And that's where you say it feels weird to say to a person off a really busy season, we're going to rest now. It's time to pause. But in doing that pause, there's an ability for you now probably to work at a harder velocity out of it, because you're pointing towards fruitfulness, not productivity.
Yeah.
We're not always trending up and to the right. Sometimes there needs to be a season where there's a fallowness to rejuvenate and energize, so we can do that. So,
I mean, what is revolutionary, to be honest, about just listening to you, Cara, is how much of this rests on our internal framing of ourselves and our work. And I know I said it earlier in the episode, but it's less about the amount of work we're doing and it's our relationship to our work. And again, I'm actually really excited by that, because it does mean that the Christian reframing of our identities and our relationships are meaningful antidotes to these red flags that we can fall into. The other reflection as I hear you speak is that it's no wonder, and I count myself in this camp, even though not this present day, but those of us in formal ministry can really struggle with burnout because of that integrative approach of what makes a good pastor in many ways.
Yep.
It's who I am. It's what I do. It's my faith. It's my calling. There is so much self-identity that comes with formal ministry, that and so much grey as to what is work and what is not.
Yes.
What's your word for formal pastors? I mean, I'm sure you've seen it in your work. Like, why is it happening? Am I hitting a nail on the head, or are there other reasons why pastors are seeming to burn out, if not more, at the very least at the same rate as those of us in inverted commas in secular workplaces?
Yeah, it's more. It's right up there with health professionals.
Okay.
They're the ones who most frequently burn out. And part of it is that idea of calling as well. There's a sense of calling to it. So it's sort of like it's not just the work that I do, but it's my whole self that I put in. But it's more than that. I remember I was speaking to a whole load of defence chaplains, and I was talking about work-life balance, even though I don't believe in the term. And this one guy said to me, well, I don't work, I do ministry. So this doesn't apply to me.
what a flex.
Ministry is 24/7.
Yep.
And I thought, in my heart, you are a great candidate for burnout. Because God hasn't made us to do 24/7. It's denial of God, and it's denial of self to think that is possible. And
We can sleep because God does not.
Yes, exactly.
Right, like there's
Sleep is a gift.
There's a great joy in acknowledging that you can sleep 8.5 hours, and while you sleep, God is still at work, accomplishing what he needs to do. And when you wake up, he is 8.5 hours ahead of you. And guess what? The next night, he's going to be 8.5 hours ahead of you.
It's beautiful.
I just don't understand why people don't get that. Like,
No, but
Jesus rested.
To
Like,
play devil's advocate, though, I do get it. You know, I get it
Yeah.
conceptually. Like, if I can be respectful enough to stir the pot on something you've said in an earlier episode, if a lot of our sacred secular divide can be debunked by seeing God in our work, doesn't that actually lead us more towards burnout tendencies? Because we actually, if we raise the dignity of our work, sorry, that was my phone going off. I'm a very popular person. Ellie, stop
That's the
messaging
first
me.
ding.
It is the first ding. I'm not that popular. If we are
27 episodes.
thanks, Mum.
Sorry. Keep on going.
Sorry.
Mum, I'll call you back.
I love you too.
I'm doing a great job. If we do reframe our work by seeing God more and more, doesn't that just raise a relationship which actually leads us to higher tendencies of burnout? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Except that it's not up to you. You're worshiping God through your work. So, and you know that God doesn't expect more of you than is physically, emotionally sustainable. Yeah. So that's something that I find really helpful to remember.
Thanks, Mum. Excuse me while I turn iMessage off my laptop. Sorry, Cara.
I'm trying to
keep
going.
Hey, Duncan. How do I turn iMessage off my laptop?
Just mute yourself.
Yeah, okay.
He
done.
hates IT.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bill's in the mail.
Oh, dear. I have
Sorry,
no idea
Cara.
where I was up to now. Oh, yes, remembering that God won't ask more of you than you can. I think that's the really good idea of a Sabbath. I was talking to a rabbi about Sabbath, and he was saying that their vision is that when it comes to a certain point, you stop. And he said, and it's like the Sabbath fairies actually take the work away, that you're actually physically incapable of working. And then magically at the end of Sabbath, the Sabbath fairies, he called them fairies, but I think angels is better. The Sabbath angels open up the work again. So it's like it's actually physically impossible to do that work. And I think that's a helpful idea, to have that complete break. And we need that complete break for mental, emotional, spiritual health. We need that break to remind ourselves that the work doesn't depend on us, that we serve the work. That the work should never be something that consumes us so entirely that we cannot leave it. It reminds us to trust God for the work that is undone.
Makes me think the frame is that God is asking me to co-labor under him.
Yes.
But he doesn't, in inverted commas, need me
No.
to fulfill his purposes. And I've thought about Sabbath as, if our two great assets are our money and our time, Sabbath is almost the tithing of our time. Can we sacrifice a precious resource and trust that God will still provide, as he does if I choose to forsake some of my money? Will my daily bread still be met? And it's a test of our faith,
Absolutely.
I think, ultimately.
Yeah, it is. It is. Will God provide?
Yeah.
Do we believe he will? And I think he does.
I think
is
he
the
does
answer.
too. But he does in the daily bread.
Yes.
And I say to people, I often want my monthly bread or my annual bread. I would have stashed the manna and said it was good stewardship if I was an Israelite. That would have been me justifying the 3 loaves in my coat, saying, I'm storing it away for a rainy day. That so would have been me.
Yeah.
I find one of the great strengths of Sabbath is the ability to shift your prayer from requests to gratitude and thanks.
Yes,
So,
nice.
One of the things that I make as a priority for prayer on Sabbath is not to petition or request anything of God, but more to take an inventory of all the great blessings God has given me and acknowledge those. So I acknowledge the bed that I slept on. That was really great. Thank you. As I open the blinds and I see the day that God has created, I will just want to give you thanks for that. Go out and make myself a cup of coffee and I'm like, thank you for the world's greatest coffee here in Australia. Is that part of the joy for me of Sabbath is this kind of inventory of pre-existing blessings that have not yet been verbalized, and the permission on a day like that to just verbalize those, because I'm not here to achieve. But in what I'm doing on the Sabbath, I can see all the different places that God has achieved around me. And we as a team made a decision, as a leadership team, we don't work on Fridays on church stuff. We don't do it. And, everyone was like, oh, but, what if some drama unfolds? I'm like, most of the time that's seek medical advice, by the way.
Consuela's making a return. We have a returning character called Consuela,
Oh my goodness.
which is the parishioner. Consuela is not a real person. She
You.
represents.
What is there a problem?
Consuela represents the.
What if somebody's in trouble?
That's Consuela.
I got it.
Who will I contact?
I think every workplace has one of those.
Everyone has a Consuela.
But I think it speaks to the fact that, like, since when was church dependent on us? It's the bride of Christ.
Yes.
And, you know, like this notion that somehow on a Friday, some massive drama is going to unfold. Like, it's like if you played through them all, right? Duncan, but what if the church is burning down? Then call the firefighters.
Yes, please.
You know, like, what if someone is robbing the premises? Then call the police. Like, am I coming in and praying over the burglars? Like, what do you want me to do? And I think that nature of saying, whatever the drama is, do we just doubt that God is not going to be at work in it or through it? And then the next day, can we not just enter into that work? Like you say, the angels just return the workload and you go, okay, well, let's go in and mop up and clean up. Let's go in and assess the damages and report insurance. Let's go to the hospital and make that visit.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes there's this unfair expectation that because you're in ministry, and some people wrongly think it's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, that you don't have permission to rest. And I think, like, that just feels like a complete fallacy.
Yep.
Like, God is in control of it. And for the most part, I'm, you know, like, here for prayer and shepherding and to encourage you to run the race the most effectively. I'm not a fire department. I'm not a medical practitioner. I'm not an ambulance, you know? And so I feel like Sabbath reminds you of that and gives you permission to say, I'm out, you know, and to say that to our team. We're out. It's God's church today. He's in control.
Awesome.
And I just think, like, it's really rewarding for our team. We pick it up again and we're like, okay, cool.
I think the other thing that Sabbath does is it gives us an opportunity to reimagine. It steps us out of the hamster wheel. So we can just look at this and say, hang on, is there a different way of doing this? What is God's way of doing this? What would God want? It can enable us to ask those sort of questions and reframe and rethink. And it can help us to do a bit of a glimpse of, you know, am I headed towards sort of burnout?
Yeah.
Am I headed down a track which is going the wrong way? Can I reimagine what my life looks like in Christ so that I can avoid that path? So yeah, I think Sabbath fulfills so many different functions that are healthy for us and important for us, and is one of the greatest prevention techniques we have against burnout. But it also enables us to see our work in the right place, in the right sphere, in the right way that we should see it in terms of our relationship with God and others.
As we begin to close up, we have someone listening who does wonder whether they're burning out. We've talked about Sabbath. What other first steps might someone take to unspiral that tendency towards burnout?
I think you need someone to walk with you in that. So here's an honest convention. My family did an intervention on me just before Christmas. So they sent my son with his Excel spreadsheets. You would like him.
Yeah. What's his number?
Yeah, okay.
And said...
Has he got a scoring system in it?
They said, okay, let's look at the work you've got coming up in the next 6 months. And how much time it's actually taking to do it, because we just think, Mum, that you just seem to be working all the time.
Wow.
And what we realised was that I had not factored into my workload preparation time for things.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, when we factored that in, we realised I was working far more days than exist.
Yep.
And so we said, right, well, we need to make some choices.
Wow.
Actually resign from a job.
Wow.
To create the space. But yeah, I knew that sort of I was pedaling fast and I was really looking forward to holidays and a break. But my family could see it much clearer than me, and they weren't just they were thinking it's not just going to be, 2 weeks at the beach that is going to unravel this.
Yeah.
It's going to actually be a different way looking forward.
Not the point of your story, but can I say what a great mum you are, you've cultivated an environment where your son can come to. No, seriously, I'm like thinking as my kids get older, I hope they have the emotional safety to have that conversation with me. So you're doing something right.
That's really beautiful. Thank you. You're a sweet guy. But I think it was, I mean, what a gift my son was to me too in that moment. That we could actually work through this together. And it was easier for me to work alongside him in doing that rather than to hear people say to me, oh, you're working too hard or you need to stop. Like that was like, yeah, but the work is there and I can't see another way of looking at it. But for someone to actually work through the process of seeing how can we do this differently, that was so helpful to me. And
what that means is you have agency. You're not helpless. You're not this victim to your burnout. You actually have agency to unpick some things that sure might be hard and have opportunity costs to them. But at the end of the day, God's asking you to steward your opportunities, and I suppose in that proverbial sense you will experience the cause and the effect one way or another of those decisions, and he's asking you to with wisdom navigate those well.
And to apply the wisdom that he's taught me over time, but also that he is present in those decisions as well. That he doesn't want me to get to the point where I sit in the front seat in the pew and I can't get up to preach. He doesn't want me at that point. He wants me to be able to sort of walk with him through those micro decisions that lead up to that. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Cara. Next week, let's talk about the relationship between those pews and the people and the job of what the church should do for its people. Before we go, I do want to highlight that you do have a couple of books available. There's a book called Worship. There's also a book called Worship Volume 2. There's a book called Worship Volume 3.
Not yet.
Not yet. On the way.
When is it, Cara? When's Volume 3?
No. I'm going to Singapore in April to meet with my publisher about Volume 3.
Great.
But yes, there's also a book called Keeping Faith, how Christian organisations can stay true to the way of Jesus. So that's another one.
Tell us a little bit more about what that's about and why it was written.
Thanks. Well, Stephen Judd, who used to run a big Christian charity called Ham & Care, and Professor John Swinton, who's from Aberdeen University in Scotland.
Aberdeen University in Scotland.
That's close.
I'm sorry to all our Scottish listeners. Excuse me.
I'll be right on work sick with you.
Put a haggis in.
My God.
Okay.
Anyway.
Can I say I love Scottish people? I really do.
I love them too. They're fine Scottish beverages.
Stop it.
Okay, sorry.
Okay.
Can't take you anywhere.
These beautiful people were concerned with how Christian charities often drift away and become more secularized. How do we stop that happening? I got involved in the project and then I realized that this is something for any Christian who runs any organization.
Sure.
You know, we want to do it in a way that has integrity. How can we make sure that we do it in a way that we continue to honor Jesus in it? And so we ended up coming to the conclusion that it's about, people talk about values and things like that, or statements of faith and so on, but we were saying they can only protect to a certain point. We actually need a deeper theology of how we run organisations and to think that through because that's often the bit that gets sort of messed up. So Christian organisations can look good from the outside, but inside they can have terrible practices and they can hurt people and bullying can be going on, but all in the name of Jesus for ministry's sake.
Which is so much more destructive
in
the fallout of it.
Yeah. I spoke at a conference this year and I asked people to close their eyes and put up their hand if they'd ever been hurt by a church or a Christian organisation. And 75% of the people put up their hand. Like, it was scary. But that's
the other
reality.
25% were new Christians.
All liars.
Yeah.
Or we're looking around and doing it.
Still processing trauma.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. It is much harder, the hypocrisy of some organisations.
Yeah.
We're very conscious of it. So how can we help organisations to think through that stuff deeply?
Right.
Yeah.
It's important work.
Thanks.
Cara, thank you so much. Next week, let's ruthlessly tear apart the church.
Great. Can't wait.
Okay. All right, we'll see you again next week on the Dead Elephants podcast. If you do have any comments, jump on the Discord channel. Don't forget, you can find Cara's books at any good bookshop. We'll see you again next week.